Having an accurate preference card, I think, is going to be key to success for all involved. The patient, number one, the collaborative staff that we've been talking about. You have anesthesia in the room, you have your surgeon, you have a circulator, you have a scrub tech, you might have an assist, or you might have a fellow, or all of these people need to have the right supplies in the right place to be able to have a successful surgery. And bottom line, you want that patient to have the best procedure.
Clock in, scrub up, and join us behind the red line. You're listening to First Case, a perioperative podcast bringing you exciting interviews, engaging discussions, and innovative solutions that are changing the way patients receive surgical care. Each episode, we talk to frontline staff, perioperative leadership, and nursing entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the back table to the boardroom, from wheels in to wheels out, we tackle the real-life issues affecting the OR. Whether you're tuning in for surgical service education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. And now, it's time to roll back and start the first case.
On today's episode of First Case, we're speaking with Jen Nichols, Senior Clinical Consultant at Cardinal Health, and we are going to be talking about something that we all love to hate, preference cards. But despite how we feel about them, they serve a critical purpose, don't they, Chris?
Yes. So stop huffing, don't roll your eyes, and listen, because there's a bigger implication here, and Jen's going to tell us all about it.
Yeah, so put your feelings aside, put your listening ears on, and don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with Jen Nichols.
Hi, I'm Chris Blevins.
And I'm Melanie Perry.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to First Case.
Joining us in the studio again today is Jen Nichols, Senior Clinical Consultant at Cardinal Health. And Jen, thank you so much for coming back to speak with us again.
Thanks for having me, Melanie. I'm excited to talk with you and Chris today.
I know I am super excited about the topic we're going to cover today. And you know, the last time we spoke with you is actually kind of what sparked the idea that, hey, we need to talk to her again. Because the last time we had you in the studio was for a vendor spotlight. And for those of you listening, if you want to look up her vendor spotlight with Cardinal Health, the title is Optimized for Accuracy, Identifying Pack Review and Procedure Card Best Practice. And obviously, as the title suggests, we were talking about best practices for building custom packs, designing custom packs, and we talked about preference cards. And that's why you are back with us today, because honestly, I think that we could talk about pref cards for an entire season and still not address all of the frustrations, the nuances, the various issues that arise from our pref card systems. So for everyone who hasn't listened to your previous interview, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. I'm an OR nurse and clinical consultant for Cardinal Health Presource. I've worked in many different operating rooms, from trauma facilities to ambulatory surgery centers. Over the past 18 years, I've been focused on both patient care and the clinical supply chain. In my role with Cardinal, I assist our OR sales reps with custom pack program reviews, Protexis surgical glove trials and implementations, new product demos, and educational needs. Our team of clinicians is on site to help our customers be the best for their patients with our OR sales reps.
And your expertise in the OR shone through in that vendor spotlight. And as we were talking and we got to talking about pref cards, I'm like, yes, we're going to talk to Jen again, because preference cards are the bane of my existence. And I think they are for everybody else as well. And ultimately, they don't have to be, but I think we all view them as some necessary evil and something that we just put up with. And instead of recognizing the opportunities and the value that a preference card can actually bring to our department and to our cases. So let's just jump right into it. Okay. Even though it's something we all love to hate, if we can get past our emotional response to preference cards and actually talk about their purpose, that's where we should begin, right? Really, Jen, let's start at the beginning. Why do we have preference cards in the first place?
I mean, I was thinking about this after you and I had our first kickoff call, and I kind of looked at it of like the who, what, when, where, why, and how. And I mean, I think all surgeons are using them. If you're not, I don't know how they're doing procedures.
It really is mind reading.
You wish sometimes,
Yeah,
and then
right?
sometimes not.
Yeah.
You're definitely going to need to have the surgeon's gloves on there, the equipment that they need, the medications that they want for that procedure, positioning, any positioning aids that they need, any different type of positioning, and then any notes that they need. You know, I always have to have XYZ when we do this procedure, or if doing this, please use this. So I think having that knowledge of just what it actually is and what it entails is good. I think they're used on a daily basis. They're always used in the OR. You can use them in other facilities throughout the other departments throughout the hospital. But I feel like the why is important, because I feel like missing items, if you're missing something off of there, or you mentioned earlier the frustrations that can be caused by not having accurate preference cards, just causes inefficiencies for the staff, could ultimately cause patient harm. No one ever wants that. Wasted supplies and just excess cost. So those are the types of things that can be affected by not having up-to-date preference cards.
Exactly. And that actually feeds right into the next thing I was going to ask you, because it's not just the nurse and the tech in the room or the surgeon who are affected by preference cards. Preference cards actually have these little tentacles that reach out and touch different areas of our health system. Where all are preference cards influencing data or influencing information?
So definitely in the OR, in that space, in the supplies that are kept in the OR. So you've got your central core area, you've got your central sterile supply that might be feeding that core. So there's different areas within the hospital that those products are stocked and supplied. So if things are being pulled and not used for a case and wasted, that means that the supply chain team needs to get additional resources in there to fulfill that waste. Or if things are riding up and down on a case cart on an elevator in the hospital and you don't have them for the case you need and you don't know where they are because they can't be located. So I think overall the OR is definitely the space, but I think it definitely, those tentacles you said, affect the supply chain. I mean, the whole, like from top to bottom in the hospital.
Right. Absolutely. And then too, also billing, because so many of our EMR systems have that pref card built into each case. And that's where we do our charting for our supplies. And if we're not charting it correctly, then we're not billing our patient correctly, which has even more downstream effects. And we're going to talk more about data later and data capture and the ways that the pref cards also help us do this. But Chris, I actually want to let you, as a surgical tech who has felt the pain of pref card,
oh my God,
let you
headache,
have the mic
right?
now. Yeah.
Well, so I'm not only a certified surgical technologist, but I'm an educator as well. And trying to explain the importance of these things is so critical. And the way that I do it is I tell them a pref card is like a procedure pack. That, close your eyes and imagine having to pull a case when time is of the essence from scratch. That the possibility of doing that in, an efficient manner is that it's impossible. And so the preference card is like your procedure pack for that particular surgery. And so not everything you need is going to be in that procedure pack. And just like that, like not everything you need is in, unfortunately, a preference card. And that it helps you help yourself if you are that person who communicates when something's wrong on a preference card. And so, we teach yourself, if you see something, say something, and trying to express to this new generation of surg techs or nurses or whoever's coming in that don't pass the buck. Right? We see that all the time. Like we roll the eyes. Nothing's ever going to be right on this card, or that surgeon's going to change their mind tomorrow anyway. And then those things aren't communicated. And so, how do we explain to people why updating these preference cards is so important, even when we know that Mr. So-and-so says he uses it all the time, isn't necessarily the way it always goes down.
Having an accurate preference card, I think is going to be key to success for all involved. The patient, number one, the collaborative staff that we've been talking about. You have anesthesia in the room, you have your surgeon, you have a circulator, you have a scrub tech, you might have an assist, or you might have a fellow, or all of these people need to have the right supplies in the right place to be able to have a successful surgery. And bottom line, you want that patient to have the best procedure. So knowing what you need ahead of time with the preference card will help you set up and get ready for that case. I mean, there's always the unknowns. You run into something you don't know. Your circulator might have to run out of the room, go grab some other things that maybe weren't even PRN items on the preference card. So it's just having accurate preference cards impacts that whole team who's there to support the patient.
Yeah, absolutely. And then to hit on that frustration point that you could hear underlying as Chris was talking, because they aren't always up to date, or people see something that's not there and they just don't say anything, or they don't bother because they're never right anyway. So who cares? What have you seen in your experience or in your practice that has worked best when it comes to ensuring that those corrections, those updates get made to preference cards? How does it work best that preference cards are correct?
That's a tough one. I mean, everywhere you go, there's different systems. I've seen handwritten in sheet protector preference cards. Oh. But I will tell you, those were probably some of the most accurate I've ever seen, because they would just pull them out of the sheet protector, erase or write over. And if something changed with that surgeon's preferences or their practice, it was immediately updated. So, I mean, I'm not saying we should go back to pen and paper, but I will say they were pretty accurate. I've seen electronic. I've seen a Rolodex with cards.
Okay, some people listening probably don't even know what a Rolodex is.
I was about to say,
Google
that's
that
been
one,
a while.
That's going to be in the same group as like your VCRs and record players. But wow, a Rolodex, that's before me. Yeah. Wow.
And my favorite is like the personal collection that people keep on themselves in their pocket. And
those actually probably are the most accurate, let's be honest.
It's true.
Their preference card might be great, but not sharing that knowledge with other people and not being able to have someone who doesn't always work in that service line be able to support the staff in that room is a knowledge gap. Like, you might be great at having all these things in your pocket and you might be the go-to person, but by not sharing that information and not telling the right people to get a preference card updated is really a detriment.
Yeah. I also think that there are some times where there's a different language used. So, the surgical technologist may call something, something, and we may need to know different information. And there's nursing information that you all might need to know. There's supply chain information that another department knows. So also making sure that the verbiage is being used correctly and that's getting into the right hands. That's crucial as well.
Yeah, I agree. And the other thing too, let's go back to these paper preference cards or note cards, really. Honestly, well, yes. Okay. So moving past their issues with infection control or infection prevention, one thing that I found really frustrating when my facility went from paper charting to an EMR was now suddenly every single procedure had its own preference card, so that every knee scope wasn't just the knee scope card we pulled out of the card box. Because before, when we were just pulling paper cards, it's everybody, Dr. Bollinger's knee scope was just Dr. Bollinger's knee scope, and we just pulled the same card and we all had the same information. And then in the corner of the card, it said, if ACL do this, and if this, then do this, and you just had one card. But then suddenly when it was EMR, we have the knee scope card, we have the ACL repair card, we have another tendon repair card, we have all these different cards. And so one correction wasn't just one erase and scribble and fix on a paper card anymore. It was fixing 6, 7, 8 different cards because they're all associated with your different ICD-9, ICD-10 codes, whatever. And I think that is part of what leads to the issues with edits and corrections. It's because it's not just one card to fix. It's every single card that affects that surgeon with that particular procedure. And introducing the human factor, we don't always get every single card, and we find out after somebody doesn't have something that we missed a card. So that certainly does happen. Anyway, that was just my, one observation from paper charting to the EMR. And I don't want to go back to paper charting ever, but I did appreciate only having one card when it came to the surgeons. But also, as we're talking about an EMR and we're talking about our charting, that's where that preference card is really doing a lot of work, right? Can you talk a little bit about how our pref cards are influencing our charting, our documentation, and billing on the back end with our surgical cases?
Sure. A lot of electronic medical records are pulling that preference card into the chart automatically. And some of those items will be listed as open 1, open 2, PRN or hold 0 or 1, and then you don't open it. So is there a time when someone hasn't gone in and updated what was actually used for the procedure? I've seen a case where someone, a circulating nurse, assumed that those charges were correct or that charting was correct and didn't go in and change anything, or opened a couple extra suture or opened a couple extra sets of gloves and never put those in the chart. So doing things like that really impacts not only the patient's legal medical record, it impacts, again, back to the supply chain, pulling those things. And if they're not being documented as used, is someone ordering more? And then just the accuracy of what was actually used for that patient. So when the preference card is feeding the electronic medical record, you want to be sure that someone is going in and updating and making sure that those things, if they're not correct, are being changed, not only for that person's record, but then back to the preference card. So you asked earlier what I've seen as successful. It varies across the board, but I've been to facilities where there's kind of an inbox by specialty, and there are certain people who are trained in how to update preference cards because we don't want everyone to be trained on it.
Right. One of the downsides of the paper pref card, everybody could fix it.
Yeah. Too many chiefs. Right.
Yes. And so I've seen it where there's been inboxes by specialty, and the people who are trained in their downtime in between cases, let's say you have a 2-hour break in between your cases and you've gotten your own lunch and you've given a break or whatever you had, and you have an extra half hour before you need to open your next case. Maybe you go over to that inbox and you update the preference card. But like you said, Melanie, it depends on how those cards are linked to one another in the system, because if you are updating lap chole, does it have angiogram? Does it not? Like,
right. Yeah.
Which one?
What does that look like? Which one is being pulled from the codes? Which procedure, which doctor, are all of them getting updated? And there are global updates within the electronic medical records and the electronic system, but is that happening, to your point?
Right. Yeah. Is it happening?
And I would also think that intraoperatively, there's got to be great communication in the team, because what you pulled versus what was actually opened, and then what was open versus what was actually used on the patient. I mean, those are very distinct differences. And those things, if you all are focused on, what was auto-populated and what you're trying to, differentiate versus what's actually happening, in the surgery, you have to have that real-time information. And you don't always, especially in those fast surgeries, you just mentioned a lap chole. My God, those things can be from 20 minutes to 45 minutes. That happens very quickly. That's a lot of things to do, plus care for the patient at the same time. I would imagine having a really good preference card is an important part of that.
Well, yeah, it absolutely is. And one of the things that I have started doing just for my own, I don't know, I guess just my own peace of mind to make sure that I document things correctly. When I go through my charting and I've got my pref card, I'm going through it, did we use it? Did we not? Did we use it? Did we not? Like we have a ton of sutures auto-filled on our preference card in our charting. I'm like, we don't use any of those, or we're not going to use them, but they're all there because they all have to have a 1 for some reason in them. So I'm like, wait a minute, we didn't use that. So when I do my charting, when I first pass through, I just go and delete. And anybody else who uses Meditech, I'm so sorry, but man, hit that F10, 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 F10. And I delete all of the sutures out of my charting, because then I can just go back. Because, we save them, right? We save our suture packs, or we should be, so that we can verify what we have on the back table. And then I've got my number, I've got it right there, and I can accurately enter, because sutures are one of those things. You don't want to have an empty shelf. You don't want to run out of a suture that is always used. And some sutures can be really, really expensive, and you don't want to miss documenting any of them, but especially some of those specialty ones that are, very expensive. That is just one way that I've tried to make sure, because then it feeds into that data, kind of like we were just talking about, right? And surgeon goes storming off into the director's office because our shelf is empty because we don't have XYZ suture. And they're like, I always use this suture. And then we run the data, and the data is like, nope, you never do. Except the data and reality don't match because of that autofill option versus accurately charting. I wonder, with your role, and we're going to jump a little bit to kind of what you do when you look at pref cards and all that data, and you're putting packs together to kind of, when you're trying to make all of our processes more efficient, how does that data and how does the accuracy of that data feed into something like our procedure packs that we're using?
So when we come in to look at your custom pack program with Cardinal, I look at your preference card. I might stop outside of a room and take a look at that preference card. It's usually right on top of the case cart. And I look at all the things that are PRN, or I might look in the extras bin that's on top of the card and say, oh, what are they pulling extra? And I look at that, but with a trained eye. I want to make sure I'm not, if there's 6 extra gowns in there, I don't think you're usually always using 6 extra gowns. But I might say, if this is a training facility or a teaching hospital, are they consistently opening maybe 2 extra gowns? Should that be something that's inside the pack? Because when those items are brought in bulk non-sterile and sterilized in the pack as a whole, it typically costs less than a single sterile gown on the shelf. So you can save money there. The facility can save money there. But looking at the preference card, I like to see and make notes for myself to maybe ask the staff in the room as they're opening the case when I'm working with them to see what might be waste in that pack, what might be things that you would want to add to that pack. I'll take the notes that I had jotted down from the preference card as PRN items and say, I noticed that you had this as PRN. Is that something you're adding all the time, or 80 to 90% of the time? Because if that's the case, maybe it should be something that's inside the pack. Then at that point, we'd need to make sure once their packs were updated and coming into the facility and all the way through production and everybody's got what they want, then the procedure card or the pref card needs to be updated to take those items off. Right. So people aren't pulling those items. So it's a very, it's an ever-changing process, right? Which is why I think it is really difficult to keep them updated all the time. But it's a full-time job for someone, but not everyone's staffing that person.
No, they are not.
Right. Jen, I have a question. You said that you get to interact with the staff. Is there like this one thing that stands out at all these facilities that you go to that you hear the most often when you talk to OR staff?
I would say mostly, I don't think our preference cards are up to date or as up to date as they should be.
No kidding.
And that's not just because we're on a podcast talking about preference cards. It's really, it's an underlying theme everywhere you go.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. And there are ways to improve, but I think improving our preference cards and working towards a goal of complete accuracy, while it seems lofty, it starts with an awareness of everything that our preference cards are doing and how they affect so much more than just my frustration when I'm opening a case and I don't have what I need, or the surgical tech when they're trying to set up their back table and they don't have something. Because, that fear of looking dumb and getting yelled at is very real. So obviously we have that. But moving beyond that to the ways, our shelves could be affected, our supply chain, our billing, our data, all of those things are all hinging upon that one little card. And understanding how much work it does, I think, is the beginning of understanding why it's so important for them to be correct. Wouldn't you say so?
Definitely. I mean, having what you need in the walls of the hospital is absolutely imperative to having a successful procedure. I'm reminded of a time where I was relieved at the end of my shift, but instead of going home, I actually drove to a different facility 5 miles away to get an implant that they needed for that procedure, the patient who was on the table. So
yikes.
I just think of things like that. And that person was under anesthesia probably longer than necessary. But I mean, and luckily someone was available to go get that. And I know that happens everywhere. That was not unique to where I was working at that time. That's the frustrating part, is that that's constantly happening. Or you learn that morning that, it is going to be with an ACL. It's not just a scope. So what do we need? What do we have? Do we have the right tray? Do we have a graft? Do we have what we need? And so I know not all of those things would be on the preference card, but most of them might be somewhere in a note that says, hey, if this, then this. And so knowing that ahead of time and just being prepared is I just keep going back to the patient. Like, I never wanted my patient to be under anesthesia longer than needed, or, learning after the fact, oh yeah, somebody had to leave mid-procedure, a different person, and go get something that was needed for your procedure. I mean, thank goodness they did, and the patient didn't have to come back for a separate procedure. But
that's happened.
Yes, that has happened too. Definitely.
No, well, I think that is probably the best way to end this conversation, is just with the real life examples of how our patients can be affected and how we can maybe be left to pick up the pieces sometimes if things aren't correct and we don't have what we need. But ultimately, you're right. It comes back to the patient, and we want the patient to have the best surgical experience possible and have the safest surgical experience possible. And our preference cards really are doing a lot of that for us to make sure that we're prepared. So Jen, thank you so much for joining us today. You really gave us just a whole lot of insight in preference cards. So thank you so much.
Thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate it. This was fun.
That was Jen Nichols, Senior Clinical Consultant at Cardinal Health. And Chris, Jen knows her pref cards, doesn't she?
Yeah, she does. I immediately started thinking the butterfly effect. How like one step just affects so many other things. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it comes down to patient safety, doesn't it? Yeah. So by God, take your corrections and send it down the chain, because at the end of the day, it's going to matter. Maybe
Absolutely.
not to you, but to somebody. And it's always going to affect the patient.
Right. You couldn't have said it better. And we really did get a lot of insight into not only how preference cards obviously affect us when we're opening cases to have what we need, but they touch on a lot of different departments. Our sterile processing department, our supply chain. We don't want to have stuff on our shelves that's gone. We want to have it there, but our documentation and our data and all of that has to match so that we can have what we need. And also so that we can be prepared. And like you said, so that the patient can have a safe, successful surgery. So guys, that is going to do it for this week's interview. On behalf of Chris, myself, and the whole team, thanks for listening to First Case.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of First Case. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to First Case on your favorite podcast app or by downloading the smartphone app on iPhone or Android. Simply search for First Case in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@firstcasemedia.com. We look forward to hearing from you.